And the program for us as a community will be on Saturday from 10 to 2, inshallah ta'ala. Is there a chair? Let's pull one back, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رضي الله تعالى عنه وعن كافة المؤمنين. The home of the Prophet ﷺ, it's important for us to discuss that because the way that the home of the Prophet ﷺ was held together is very indicative, very important for us to understand. So tonight's short lecture, inshallah ta'ala, will sort of build a foundation for next week's lecture, because next week's, and tonight and next week, inshallah, we'll still be talking about Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, but this is very important lessons for us to understand when it comes to communal solidarity, inshallah ta'ala. The first thing is that the Prophet's marriage to Aisha, the Prophet ﷺ, his marriage to Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, we get a lot of detail about how he was as a husband and how she was as a wife. And in the narratives about this, they're very beautiful, and they demonstrate the type of love, the type of companionship that we should strive to establish as believing men with our wives and as believing women with our husbands. And this foundation that inshallah we'll build tonight will then be challenged by next week's lesson about some of the issues that came up later on. So we know that the habit of the Prophet ﷺ when he would come home, when this is narrated to us all by Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she narrates that on a normal day the Prophet ﷺ, on a normal night, he would come home from Salat al-Aisha, he sallallahu alaihi wasallam would come home, he would do miswak. One of the first things that he would do is he would use miswak when he came home. He would also just go lie down and he would rest. And usually around in the middle of the night, he would awaken and he would wake up his wife as well, and they would perform Salat al-Witr. And after that, usually, sometimes, although not all the time, Aisha narrates that they would do ibadah, some form of voluntary ibadah together until Fajr time. At Fajr time, the Prophet ﷺ, she says, would pray his sunnahs at home, and after his sunnahs, they would talk together. So he and she would have a conversation. They would talk for a while until it was time for the fard salat. When it was time for the fard salat, then she narrates that he sallallahu alaihi wasallam would then leave the home, go to the masjid, and then pray the fard. Now Aisha, she said this was his routine. Notice how there was a balance between ibadah and a balance between the personal conversation. Very important, that personal life, the family life, and the ibadah. Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha narrates that she was in charge of regulating and taking care of his daily routine. She says that when he would come home in the morning, after shuruq and things of that nature, he would come home, and she says she would wash his hair. And then she says, after that, she would comb his hair, his Mubarak hair. And then she says that after that, she would put oil on him, misk, some oil. This was her routine. Radiyallahu ta'ala, look at the care that she's devoted to taking care of sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then she says after that, after she would put misk on him, she would prepare 3 cups. One cup would have his water in it, and inside that cup he would keep his miswak, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second cup would have water for his wudu. So whenever he would be more like a bowl, whenever he would need to refresh his wudu, that water would be available for him. And in the third cup would usually have some type of drink. On occasion, though not always, on occasion she would prepare a type of drink which would be similar to like a juice drink, something sweet the Prophet ﷺ would like. She mentions that when he would travel, she would always prepare his his travel bag. And the Prophet ﷺ would always, whenever he traveled, he would always randomly select which companion, which of his wives he would select. But regardless, Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha narrates she would prepare his bag. And when she prepared his bag, she made sure to always include 5 or 6 important items, personal items of the Prophet ﷺ. First thing she would include was his comb. She always made sure the Prophet ﷺ had his comb with him. The second thing she would include was his scissors. And the scissors he would use to trim his hair or to trim his mustache. The third thing was a mirror. The Prophet ﷺ, when he traveled, carried a small mirror for obvious reasons. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ cared about his appearances. This is very indicative, very important that as men we should care, we say in English, take pride in how you look, but it's not an arrogant pride. Care about how we look. And the Prophet ﷺ used to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves to see the traces of His ni'am on His creatures. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us bounties and given us blessings, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves to see the traces of those blessings on us. So if He's given us oils, if He's given us things to groom ourselves with, so He loves to see that we use those things. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, she said, she would always include some oil. The Prophet ﷺ used to always use oil. When he would use oil, the ulama narrate that the Prophet ﷺ would put it in the palm of his hand. He would put it in the palm of his left hand, and then he would smear the oil with his fingers, and then put it on him. ﷺ. If he did not have oil, then at the very least, he ﷺ would use olive oil. So if he didn't have any good smelling oil, then at the very least he used olive oil, and he would always put olive oil on if he had nothing else to use. So she made sure, radiallahu ta'ala anha, that there was some type of oil, something that the Prophet ﷺ to put on him, even if it was olive oil. The other thing is that the Prophet ﷺ used to carry kuhl when he would travel, and so she would make sure that kuhl was there, and of course the miswak. She always made sure that his miswak was ever present. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. She narrates so many beautiful stories about their home together. They were a family. They had a very strong bond, the two of them. She narrates that when they were home, they drank together. She said, when the Prophet ﷺ would be thirsty, I would go and get him a drink and from his cup. And when I offered him the drink, he would insist that I drink first. Look at the ithar. This is called ithar, preference. So the first sign of love, mahabba, whether it's love that you have to your spouse, your companion, or love for your brother or your sister in Islam, the first sign of that love is preference, preferential treatment. Open the doors for each other. You prefer to do things for each other. You prefer for your brother to have something better than you, etc. That type of preference. So the Prophet ﷺ would insist that she take the first drink. And she would drink, and then she said, after she drank, she would give the cup, pass the cup to the Prophet ﷺ, and he would turn the cup and drink and put his lips on the same spot that she put her lips on. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And drink from. This is what she narrates. She said there would be meat on occasion that we would have. Although she does narrate that there would be months, there would be times when an entire month would go by and there would be no flame, no fire in their home, she would narrate. A whole month and there would be no fire in their home. But on the rare occasions that they did have meat, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he would take the meat and he would offer it from her to bite from his fingers. She would bite from the meat, and then she says that he would then bite from the same place where she bit from, subhanAllah. And so they had this sharing relationship. She says that on most occasions, she said, if anybody tells you that we got full off of dates, right? She says, if anyone ever told you that we used to get full off of dates, she said, know that they're lying. She said, we never got full off of dates except on one occasion. She said, and that was the occasion after the event of Khaybar, when the Prophet ﷺ had captured or conquered the area of Khaybar, and it was a very large date palm section. And she said, on that one time, we experienced what it was like to be full off of dates. And then she said, and the following year the Prophet died, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? She says that when we would go on the Eid, she said on every Eid, we would go together to the masjids, because during the Eid times, the Habashis, right, the Ethiopians would put on performances in the masjid. And we would watch those performances together, and she narrates how the Prophet ﷺ would raise her up, right, above, on his shoulder level, so that she could see the performance better. Right? This tells us that when they engaged in entertainment, that they were physically together at that time on the Eid. And he ﷺ would keep her there until she was content watching. And when she was content, he would ask her, have you had enough, O Aisha? And she would say, not yet. And he would continue to make sure that she had the best seat that was there. On occasion, she says that, they would play. They would be walking around outside, and he ﷺ would say, I'll race you. And then he would take off, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then she would run. And on the first couple times he won, he beat her, and he used to play with her, he used to antagonize her. See, well, I thought you were young, you have this energy, you're from family of as-Sadiq, this is all you have to offer. Right? He would taunt her. Right? And so after 3rd or 4th times, she would beat him. Right? And so they had this beautiful sense of musabaqah, right? Competition, which was very lovely. She narrates that one day they left the home, and the Prophet they were leaving, walking together, shoulder to shoulder. And the Prophet ﷺ, as they left the home, he nudged her, right? Just like you nudge someone. Just nudged her, joking with her, and she nudged him back, and he nudged her, and they pushed each other to see who could get out the front door together, right? Look at sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? How he took specific care with his wife. He had a neighbor who was from a Persian background. And one of his neighbors, Aisha, narrates this beautiful narration, radiallahu ta'ala, the neighbor invited the Prophet ﷺ for dinner. And this neighbor was known to cook what we would call kebabs, meat very well. His grilling was famous in Medina. So he invited the Prophet ﷺ over one night for some meat. And so the Prophet ﷺ showed up with Aisha. And the neighbor said, who is this? He said, is she not invited? And the neighbor, he said, no. And sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, assalamu alaikum, and left. The second time the neighbor invited him, and he came up, showed up with Aisha. And he said, who is this? He said, this is Aisha. Is she invited? He said, no. And sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, assalamu alaikum. He left. Third time, again he was invited. And when the neighbor opened the door, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, is she invited? And the neighbor, he said, yes. And he said, assalamu alaikum, and entered the home. Right? Now, look at the dedication of the Prophet ﷺ to do things as a family. To stay together as a family. And to not engage and not to deal with anyone who's interested in the separation of the family. Very important. We have to take this metaphor to the next level when it comes to communal relations and divisions in our community. We cannot allow things to creep in between us like this. She also narrates that she used to, on occasion, beautify herself for the Prophet ﷺ, and on one occasion she put on 2 rings on her fingers, and he ﷺ would always compliment her. But he noticed these 2 rings for the first time. He said, Aisha, where did these come from? And she mentioned that this was part of her jewelry, and she was wearing it for the first time. And although he complimented her on the way she looked, he always had the perspective of the akhirah as well. And so he asked her, Ya Aisha, have you paid zakat on those rings? Have you paid zakat? Did you pay zakat on those rings? And she said, no. And he said, Aisha, is the hellfire enough for you? Is that what you want? In other words, pay your zakat, then beautify yourself. Always have the perspective of the halal, and making everything halal at all of its levels, even when you beautify. So pay your zakat, then put the jewelry on. MashaAllah. She mentions also that other intimate stories about their dealings with each other, that even when she was fasting or he was fasting, he would want her to be close to him. he sallallahu alaihi wasallam would kiss her when she was fasting and vice versa. Things she would narrate to teach the Muslims about how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was very close to his wives. She used to accompany him on many military expeditions. She was with him at Uhud. She was with him at Hudaybiyah. She was with him at the Battle of the Trenches, Ghazwat al-Khandaq. She was with him at Fath al-Makkah. She was with him at Khaybar. She was with him when he was giving the farewell sermon, Khutbat al-Wada. She was with him at all of these moments. And she witnessed all of these things, and she stuck by his side. They were very, very, very close, and they had a very loving bond with each other. So this is very, very important. As we close, we have to understand that this was a woman who was very close to the Prophet ﷺ, very beloved, and she had a very, very tight bond with him, and the community knew that. The believers knew that. So much so that when they would send gifts, they would always send gifts to the house of Aisha, not, for example, to the house of Sauda or something of that nature. They always sent gifts to the house of Aisha, because they knew that that would get to the Prophet ﷺ, and if it came from Aisha, if Aisha gave it to the Prophet ﷺ, he would receive it in a certain way, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the community understood the importance of that bond. Next week, we will discover how that bond was attempted to be broken as we go into the area of the ifk, the lie that was perpetrated against Aisha radiallahu ta'ala. That story has profound ramifications on communal solidarity and communal relations. As a community, that story becomes the paradigm, the key point in what it means to be a community and what it means to stick together. And so, but in order to understand that correctly, we have to understand what their relationship was like, and who she was, what type of person she was, how devoted she was, and how much the Prophet ﷺ loved her, how much was at stake there. And even the last thing we'll mention is that after the marriage to Aisha, the wahi used to come down only in her home. It did not come down in the home of Sauda radiallahu ta'ala anha, for example. It did not even come down later on in the home of Hafsa, for example, radiallahu ta'ala. It kept coming down in the home of Aisha radiallahu ta'ala, all the way until later on in year 6 or 7 after Hijrah, when the Prophet ﷺ married Salama. Then, and only then, would the wahi change and start coming down in the home of Salama. And when we talk about Salama, we'll understand why that happened, that shift happened. There was a very powerful shift that occurred, because Salama brought in a very new level of akhlaq and a new level of communal solidarity, a very different level of relationship with the Prophet ﷺ. So this is very important for us. We'll end now, inshallah ta'ala. And next week, inshallah, all of you are here next week, because next week's dars will be very important for all of us, inshallah ta'ala, in our endeavor to learn how to be closer as a community and what it means to bond together as brothers and sisters. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. وإياكم. الله. وعليكم السلام. شكرا بارك الله فيك. شكرا.
Assalamu alaikum. Just a quick reminder, tomorrow Fajr Salah will be at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Assalamu alaikum.